Hey World History. So today we are going to start our next unit, and we are going to kind of move relatively quickly through this unit because I want to get to at least the World Wars before the end of the year, which is coming up pretty quickly. We're almost there, guys. We've almost done it. Please keep me in contact if you do have any issues or problems or anything so that I can help you, okay? So today we're actually going to work through two sections, but we're going to do it kind of quickly, and your Junopod does cover them both. So we're going to start with philosophy in the age of reason, and we're going to start with the scientific revolution. So scientific successes are just continuing. They're starting to develop vaccines against smallpox, which quite frankly was killing an awful lot of people. Scientific successes are convincing educated Europeans of the power of human reason, so natural law, which are rules discoverable by reason, govern scientific forces such as gravity and magnetism. Immanuel Kant, a German philosopher, wrote the Critique of Pure Reason and was the first to describe the era with the term Enlightenment. Despite Kant's skepticism about the power of reason, he was enthusiastic about the Enlightenment, and that's what kind of this era of orderly revolutionary thinking is called, the Enlightenment. So we've got two philosophers that have kind of conflicting views. One of them is Thomas Hobbes and the other is John Locke, all right? So they set forth ideas that were to become key to the Enlightenment. Both men lived through the English Civil War, but they came to very different conclusions about the human nature and how government should work. So Hobbes believes in powerful government. All right, so Thomas Hobbes outlined his ideas in a work called The Leviathan. All right, and the Leviathan, in it he argued that people were naturally cruel, greedy, and selfish. If not strictly controlled, they would fight, rob, and oppress. Life in the state of nature without laws or other control would be solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. So to escape this life, Hobbes said that people needed to enter into a social contract. And in the social contract, they gave up their freedom for the sake of an orderly society. Hobbes believed that only a very powerful government could ensure this orderly society, and he believed in absolute monarchies, which could impose order. So that was his belief. Locke, though, John Locke was different. And John Locke advocates natural rights, life, liberty, and property, later known as the pursuit of happiness. If that sounds familiar, that's because that's what our independence was declared upon. So these are natural rights. He wrote a book called The Two Treatises of Government. Well, not a book, more of a treatise. So natural rights. And unlike Hobbes, Locke rejected absolute monarchy. He wanted a government that would have limited power, that respected all the citizens. Locke wrote that he thought James II, who was the one that was dethroned in the Glorious Revolution, deserved to be dethroned for violating the rights of the English. He said that basically if the government fails to fulfill its obligations and violates people's natural rights, then it deserves to be overthrown. This is the idea that really helps launch the American Revolution, and lots of revolutions across Latin America and Central America to follow, and even France. So, in the 1700s, there was this flowering of Enlightenment thought. This happened when a group of Enlightenment thinkers in France applied the methods of science to understand society. These thinkers were called philosophes, meaning philosophers, in France. In French. So you've got your philosophes. So that's scientific thinking plus societal thinking. So one of them was the Baron de Montesquieu. Montesquieu studied the governments of Europe from Italy to England. He read about ancient medieval Europe, learned about Chinese, Native Americans. He studied all the governments. And he published something called The Spirit of the Laws, in which he discussed government throughout history. He thought the best way to protect liberty was to divide the government among three branches: legislative, executive, and judicial. If that sounds familiar, that's because that's what we have. Okay? So this guy was one of the first ones to think of it. Montesquieu. U-I-E-U, so three branches of government. So he also had that belief of like checks and balances, so no one branch of government should have too much power. Voltaire, another philosophe, defended the freedom of thought, and he used wit and sarcasm to expose the abuses of his day. And so Voltaire's outspoken attacks offended the French government and the Catholic Church, and so he was imprisoned and forced into exile with all of his books burned, as is wont to happen. But he continued to defend the principle of freedom of speech. Now, another guy, Denis Diderot, worked for years to produce a 28-volume set of books called the Encyclopedia. As the editor, he did more than just to compile articles, though. He wanted to explain ideas on government, philosophy, religion. Diderot's encyclopedia included articles by leading thinkers of the day like Montesquieu and Voltaire. In these articles, they denounced slavery, they praised freedom of expression, they urged education for all, they attacked divine right, and they even attacked some traditional religions. Critics raised an outcry because you can't talk bad about Catholicism. But despite this, more than 4,000 copies were printed, and when translated into other languages, it really helped to spread the Enlightenment. So Diderot is one of the ones who helped spread it with his encyclopedia. Then you've got another guy, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and Rousseau promotes his writing, The Social Contract. So Diderot Encyclopedia, and Rousseau, The Social Contract. And the social contract believed that people in their natural state were basically good. This innocence, he felt, was corrupted by the evils of society. Many reformers adopted this view, such as Thomas Paine and the Marquis de Lafayette, which, if you're familiar with Hamilton, you've heard of. In 1762, he set forth these ideas in his book, The Social Contract. He felt that society placed too many limitations. He wanted governments to be freely elected and to have minimal control. He put his faith in the general will of the people. And really this went on to influence for 200 years. He hated political and economic oppression, and his writing would also help fan the flame of all the revolutions to come. Women also challenged the philosophes because the slogan free and equal did not apply to them. You had a couple people, Germaine d'Estel in France, Catherine Macaulay, and Mary Wollstonecraft in Britain, argued that women were being excluded, but they were made fun of and condemned. Wollstonecraft was a well-known British social critic. She wrote something called A Vindication of the Rights of Women. She called for equal education for boys and girls. She said only education could help women advance in life. French thinkers known as physiocrats focused on economic reforms too. Like the philosophes, the physiocrats based their thinking on natural laws. And so you have this replacement of the system of mercantilism with this concept of laissez-faire. Now, laissez-faire literally means hands off. Hands off means the government does not bother them. Government allows businesses to operate with little or no interference. You also have another Scottish economist, Adam Smith, who admires the physiocrats, writes The Wealth of Nations, and argues that the free market should regulate business activity, not the government. Manufacturing, trade, wages, profits, economic growth were all linked to the market, supply, demand. He felt that the government had the duty to protect society, administer justice, public works, but he didn't necessarily want them all over the economy. And so that was his concept on all of this. And so I know there was a lot of people, but what should be more important than maybe their individual names is the ideas that they're putting forth. Because our country, even today, still follows a lot of the ideas that they created during this time. So now let's talk about the ideas spreading. What happens when Enlightenment ideas spread? So I'll write that down. Enlightenment ideas spread. And if you're following along in the book, this is actually section 2 of the chapter. So, new ideas are challenging society. People are starting to challenge the class system. Writers are starting to face censorship, which is restricting of access to ideas and information. Who's usually doing the censorship? The government and the Catholic Church. They don't want people to get too many ideas. They don't want people to rebel. And so this idea of censorship is something that the philosophes very much fought against. Now, ideas are spreading in places called salons, which are informal social gatherings. Writers, artists, philosophes, others could all exchange ideas. One was run by Madame Zouffran in France, and she brought the brightest and most talented people. Somebody that came and played for her was Wolfgang Mozart, who's also around in this time period. And arts and literature that are being produced are also reflecting these new ideas. In the 1600s and 1700s, the arts are evolving from grandeur to charm. In the age of Louis XIV, back when he was building Versailles, you had this style called Baroque. If you're in Beauty and the Beast, you might remember the line, if it's not Baroque, don't fix it. Because Baroque is a style. It's a musical style, but it's also an artistic style. Baroque is huge, grand. It glorifies battles, the lives of saints, colorful, ornate. But Louis XV and Louis XVI led considerably less formal. And so you go from this style of Baroque to the style called Rococo. Rococo moves away from religion. Unlike the heavy splendor, Rococo is more elegant, lighter, charming, encouraged the imagination, charming rural settings, happy servants, pets. The style was criticized by the philosophes because it seemed a little bit superficial, but most people really enjoy the new Rococo style. And I'm going to swap out my markers because this one's starting to die, which is sad. All right, so the Enlightenment also inspires composers, new forms of music. The music goes from Baroque to what we call classical. So not all classical music is classical. Actually, half of Beethoven's stuff isn't technically classical. It's technically romantic. But in this Baroque classical era, you've got Johann Sebastian Bach, who was a devout German Lutheran, who wrote religious works for organs and choirs and sonatas for violin and harpsichord. You have another German guy, Georg Friedrich Handel, who wrote a lot of his time in England. He wrote water music, the Messiah. So if you know the Hallelujah chorus, this was written then. Oh, that's better. So composers, you've got Bach, Handel. Then Haydn, Franz Joseph Haydn, developed forms for the string quartet and the symphony, things that are played a lot today. Also the source of many excellent and terrible musical puns. And then Haydn's friend, Mozart, who became even more famous than him in today's age. Mozart was a child prodigy. He died at the age of 35, but he produced so much music within that short amount of time. And then you also have a new literature form called the novel. Daniel Defoe writes Robinson Crusoe. There's a novel called Pamela written. So this novel, just stories about people in their own times, is new. People haven't done that before. And then you have this thing called the enlightened despot. Okay? So this is possibly the most interesting and maybe the strangest concept. Enlightened despots. So, the courts of Europe became enlivened as the philosophes are trying to persuade the rulers to adopt their ideas. Some monarchs did accept Enlightenment ideas, but others still practiced absolutism. Those that did accept the new ideas became enlightened despots, which are absolute rulers that are trying to use their power to bring about these changes, but not to relinquish any of their power. Some of them, some examples, Frederick the Great, aka Frederick II, we heard about him last chapter. He's king of Prussia. He fought in the War of Austrian Succession. So Frederick II, also known as the Great. They're just throwing these the Great titles out everywhere. He saw himself as the first servant of the state, duty to work towards the common good. Frederick praised Voltaire's works, invited several of the French intellectuals to Prussia. He wanted to reduce the use of torture, allow freedom of the press. Most of his reforms were directed at making the Prussian government more efficient. He reorganizes the civil service. He simplifies laws. Tolerates religious differences. He wanted a stronger monarchy, though, and he wanted more power for himself. He believed in enlightened reform, but he believed that he was supposed to be the one to bring it out. He didn't want to give others power. Another person who studied the philosophes was Catherine the Great of Russia, who we learned about last chapter. So Catherine the Great, whoops. So this is Russia. And remember, Prussia is pretty much parts of Germany. Not to be confused with Russia. Catherine exchanged letters with Voltaire and Diderot. She wanted to fight the united enemies of humankind, which are superstition, fanaticism, ignorance, and trickery. So Catherine believed in the Enlightenment ideas of equality and liberty. She toyed with implementing some Enlightenment ideas. She abolished torture. She established religious tolerance. She grants nobles charters of rights. She criticizes serfdom. But she doesn't want to give up any power, right? So she doesn't actually lessen the government in Russia. She just makes it a little bit better for the people. And then another one in Austria, after Habsburg Maria Theresa ruled, she didn't push for reforms, but she was considered to be an enlightened despot because she did work to improve the life of the peasants. But the most radical in Austria was her son, Joseph II. So Joseph II of Austria. Just hold that up so you can see that bottom bit. And he continued the work. He wanted to modify the government. He supported religious equality for Protestants and Jews in an empire that was mostly Catholic, so that was kind of a big deal. He ended censorship. He allowed a freedom of the press. He attempted to bring the Catholic Church under royal control. Didn't necessarily go that well, but he tried. He sold the property of many monasteries, and he used the proceeds to support other monasteries that were involved in education, caring for the sick, hospitals, things like that. But like many of those reforms, he even abolished serfdom. So he gets rid of serfdom. Unfortunately, after he dies, his next successor brings it back, but he tried. But the thing is, like, all of these things, we go through all of these ideas, all of these concepts, all of these changes, but the lives of the majority of Europeans are actually changing very slowly. They remained what they'd always been, peasants, middle class. Echoes of serfdom are still remained. But these radical ideas are finally starting to seep into the peasant villages. While some peasants are like, yes, top of the old order. Others are kind of like, we don't want to change. Think about people today. People today don't necessarily want change, right? Change is interesting. Not everybody's fighting for it. And it's the same way back then. They're not sure what that change is going to look like. Unfortunately for them, change comes whether they like it or not. And by the time we get to the 1800s, half of Europe is being completely upheaved in politically or through war or revolution, French Revolution. And so we'll talk about all of that later. But that is the end for today. On Monday, we will go through the American Revolution. But yeah, hope you found it interesting. Hope you recognize some stuff. This is where a lot of our ideas come from. So with that said, good luck. Enjoy your weekend because I will not talk to you before then. And have an awesome rest of your day. Bye, guys.